Hi. I knew I needed to exist in a world where there was a Zadie Smith long before I had read any Zadie Smith. And for many years, because of On Beauty, The Autograph Man, and those sublime essays on joy, Kafka, and comedy, I thought I knew Zadie Smith, even though I hadn't yet met her. Zadie Smith came to me first as a name on a bright red novel that was handed to me by my mother when I was 17. I was in between that awkward slump of being both a listless teenager and a defiant young woman, and my mother gave me White Teeth with the unexpressed hope that I would find something by which to steer myself by, or accompany me in my moody brooding and my strange teenage silences, in which books seemed to take on an outsized importance. There's an interview that Zadie did not too long ago where she said, "The English language is the greatest love of her life. And although not for the same reasons, I do feel the same way. Whenever I talk about my love of reading, I feel I have to preface what inspires this love, the fact that I couldn't read until I was very old. And when something is denied to you, when you are barred from entrance into a place that you most want to inhabit, your desire only intensifies. For me, my inability to read for so many years made me only love reading more. So I was a voracious reader by the time I got my hands on White Teeth. And yet, I had never read anything like that book before. It seemed to sum up the messy perfection of the entire universe and the chaos of life. And although I was only a teenager, I could recognize its humanism and the writer's enormous genius, who herself at the time was only 24. I remember being startled out of the funk of my teenage bed by this sentence. While he slipped in and out of consciousness, the position of the planets, the music, the spheres, and the flap of a tiger moth's diaphanous wings in Central Africa, and a whole other bunch of stuff that makes shit happen, had decided it was second chance time for Archie. Somewhere, somehow, somebody decided that he would live. When Joanna Biggs reviewed Swing Time last month in the London Review of Books, she wrote that because she was a young British woman who was headed to Oxford the same year that White Teeth arrived, she felt almost invested in Zadie's story, susceptible to the bildung in all of this. I can't even lie. When I read this sentence, I was furious. I was really, really upset, mostly because this feeling of intimacy that Biggs felt, this sense that Zadie's work is a beacon against despair, was something that I thought was very specific to me. I thought I owned that. I thought Zadie's verve, her winking humor, her ability to write a description with so much naturalness and pace so that it feels like she can pause the moment and hold it up to the light and inspect it before rendering it back to us with each detail perfectly felt, was something that I alone marveled at and truly understood. What Biggs revealed to me is that what is true of Zadie's talent is what is true of any great. It has many perceptive admirers, all of us feeling like she's someone who knows how to write down the contours of our very souls. E.M. Forrester once wrote in Aspects of a Novel that the specialty of a novel is that the writer can talk about his characters as well through them and can arrange for us to listen when they talk to themselves. He has access to the self-communings, and from that level he can descend even deeper and peer into the subconscious. Zadie does all of this, but she also offers us as readers that musky, wonderful truth that Amiri Baraka once called something in the way of things. And most of all, she then says, most gloriously, most poetically, that we must surrender our confines and personal limitations to travel freely and vulnerably with her. When I met Zadie at Columbia 5 years ago, much like the narrator in Swing Time, I belabored over my outfit. One hopes that if nothing else, that the people we most admire in the world will recognize in us something admirable and say, "Wow, you are my damn double. Let's get a drink and become best friends." This didn't happen. Zadie is very warm, she's wickedly funny, and she's full of questions, but she, at that time, had a lecture to give. There was work to do. So I walked her to that hall and watched as she low-key gave every student there a panic attack. Zadie's one of those people whose talent is so natural and so abundant, it's like watching Michael Jackson or Nijinsky or Flojo in their prime. At times it feels impossible. When I found out a month later that she'd be teaching one class at that school, I treated it like getting tickets to Glastonbury. I sprawled out in front of the dean's office and stayed there until I was assured entrance into her course. Zadie said in LUK not too long ago that I was exasperated by her in that class, and my head was always on the table. This is not true. I have attention deficit disorder. More seriously, though, it was a case of the nerves. What Zadie didn't know was that for many of us who had been reading her for decades now, the experience was absolutely surreal. Because in my mind, Zadie had always been one of my greatest teachers. When she gently mocks the academy in On Beauty, I remember thinking, this woman knows me. She knows the batshit professors my mom brought me around. When she writes about those Kilburn facelifts, too tight gel ponytails, and diamante jewelry, you know Zadie understands South Philly, Northwest London, Sunderland, and Detroit. And when I once told her that I was fearful as a Black woman about the possibilities of truly living off words and books alone, she said, no, keep on. We are the author of our own stories. And I knew then that Zadie is also evidence of what Alice Walker has called the anonymously handed-on creative spark, the seed of the flower that our mothers and grandmothers never hoped to see. This is to say that ever since my mother first gave me white teeth, and this pried from my childish hands my Madeline N'Engle books, my Roald Dahl books, and expanded my universe beyond the books that I love, but books that didn't see me at all as a Black woman, Zadie's work has made me feel less lonely. These are indeed strange days, but what gives me hope is that Zadie still heralds a future where the greatest living British writer in the world is a woman from Northwest London who has a Jamaican mom, an Irish husband, 2 fantastic kids, a passion for Beyonce, reads Muriel Spark and Zora Neale Hurston and Natalia Ginsburg, and can take a very impressive picture if she so chooses. And I've always wanted to live in a world where this is the case, and I'm so grateful that I do. Thank you.
Hi. Hey, how you doing? Hi. Thank you. Slightly overwhelmed by that introduction. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. An extraordinary writer and person, as you can see. I'm going to read for about 20 minutes. Just a few chapters. The chapters are short in this book. And I just need to tell you a little bit so you kind of know where we are. So the narrator, it has no name. She has a friend called Tracy. They met in a dance class, Miss Isabel's dance class. And the narrator has a Jamaican mother who, through the course of the novel, becomes an MP in Parliament, becomes quite a significant personage. Tracy, meanwhile, has a white mother and a Jamaican father, who at this point in the story is in prison. But Tracy tells everyone that, in fact, he's Michael Jackson's backing dancer, and that's why he's not around. So that's where they are. Long before it became her career, my mother had a political mind. It was in her nature to think of people collectively. Even as a child, I noticed it and felt instinctively there was something chilly and unfeeling in her ability to analyze so precisely the people she lived among, her friends, her community, her own family. We were all at one and the same time people she knew and loved, but also objects of study, living embodiments of all she seemed to be learning up at Middlesex College. She held herself apart, always. She never submitted, for example, to the neighborhood cult of sharpness, the passion for shiny shell suits and sparkling fake gems, for whole days spent in the hair salon, children in 50-quid sneakers, couches paid for over several years on hire purchase. Although neither would she ever entirely condemn it. People are not poor because they've made bad choices, my mother liked to say. They make bad choices because they're poor. But though she was serene and anthropological about these matters in her college essays or while lecturing me and my father across the dinner table, I knew in her real life she was often exasperated. She didn't pick me up from school anymore, my father did that now, because the scene there aggravated her too much. In particular, the way each afternoon time collapsed, and all those mothers became kids again, kids who'd come to collect their kids, And all of these kids together turned from school with relief, free finally to speak with each other in their own way, in their own patois, and to laugh and joke and eat ice cream from the waiting ice cream van and make what they considered to be a natural amount of noise. Well, my mother didn't fit into all of that any longer. She still cared for the group intellectually, politically, but she was no longer one of them. But every now and then she did get caught up in it, usually by some error of timing, and found herself trapped in a conversation with another mother, often Tracy's, on Willesden Lane. And on these occasions she could turn callous, making a point of mentioning each new academic achievement of mine or inventing some. Although she knew that all Tracy's mother could offer in return was more of Miss Isabel from dance classes' praise, which was, to my mother, an entirely worthless commodity. My mother was proud of trying harder than Tracy's mother, than all the mothers, of having got me into a half-decent state school instead of one of the several terrible ones. She was in a competition of caring, and yet her fellow contestants, like Tracy's mother, were so ill-equipped when placed beside her that it was a fatally lopsided battle. I often wondered, is it some kind of trade-off? Do others have to lose so we can win? Well, one morning in early spring, my father and I ran into Tracy under our block of flats by the garages. She seemed agitated, and though she said she was only cutting through our estate on the way to her own, I felt certain she'd been waiting for me. She looked cold. I wondered whether she'd been to school at all. I knew she sometimes played hooky with the approval of her mother. My mother had been shocked to see them both one school day afternoon coming out of a shop on the high road, laughing, carrying a load of bags. I watched my father greet Tracy warmly. Unlike my mother, he had no anxiety in connection with her. He found her single-minded dedication to dancing sweet, and also, I think, admirable. It appealed to his work ethic. And it was very clear that Tracy adored my father, was even a little in love with him. She was so painfully grateful for the way he talked to her like a father, although sometimes he went too far in this direction, not understanding that what came after borrowing a father for a few minutes was the pain of having to give him back. "Exams coming up, aren't they?" he asked her now. "And how's all that going?" Tracy stuck her nose proudly in the air. "I'm doing all 6 categories." "Course you are." "For modern, though, I ain't doing it by myself. I'm pairing. Ballet's my strongest, then tap, then modern, then song and dance. I'm going for 3 golds at least, but if it was 2 golds and 4 silvers, I'd be well happy with that." "And so you should be." She put her little hands on her hips. "You coming to watch us then, or what?" "Oh, I'll be there, with bells on, cheering my girls on." I saw how she loved to boast to my father, unfurled in his presence, sometimes even blushed, and the monosyllabic no and yes answers she tended to give all other adults, including my mother, disappeared, to be replaced by this running babble as if she thought any pause in the flow might run the risk of losing my father's attention altogether. "Got some news," she said casually, turning to me, and now I understood why we'd run into her. "My mum sorted it." "Sorted what?" I asked. "I'm leaving my school," she said. "I'm coming to yours." Later at home, I told my mother this news, and she too was surprised and, I suspected, a little displeased at this proof of Tracy's mother's efforts on her daughter's behalf more than anything else. She kissed her teeth. "I really didn't think she had it in her." It took Tracy moving to my classroom for me to understand what my classroom really was. I'd thought it was a room full of children. In fact, it was a form of social experiment. The dinner lady's daughter shared a desk with the son of an art critic. A boy whose father was presently in prison shared a desk with the son of a policeman. And the child of the postal officer, me, shared a desk with the child of one of Michael Jackson's backing dancers. One of Tracy's first acts as my new desk mate was to articulate these subtle differences by way of a simple, compelling analogy: Cabbage Patch Kids versus Garbage Pail Kids. Each child was categorized as one of the other, and she made it clear that any friendship I'd formed before her arrival was now, and as far as it attempted to cross this divide, null and void, worthless, for the truth was it had never truly existed in the first place. There could be no real friendship between Cabbage Patch and Garbage Pail, not right now, not in England. She emptied our desk of my beloved Cabbage Patch Kid card collection and replaced them with her Garbage Pail cards, which, like almost everything Tracy did in school, at once became the new craze. Even children who were, in Tracy's eyes, Cabbage Patch types themselves began to collect the Garbage Pail Kids. Even Lily Bingham collected them, and we all competed with each other to own the most repulsive cards. The Garbage Pail Kid with snot streaming down his face, or the one pictured on the toilet. Her other striking innovation was her refusal to sit down. She would only stand at her desk, bending forward to work. Our teacher, a kind and energetic man called Mr. Sherman, battled her for a week, but Tracy's will, like my mother's, was made of iron, and in the end she was allowed to stand as she pleased. I don't think Tracy had any special passion for standing up. It was a point of principle. Principle could have been anything, really, but the point was she would win it. And it was clear that Mr. Sherman, having lost this argument, felt he must come down hard in some other area. And one morning, as we were all excitedly swapping Garbage Pail Kids, instead of listening to whatever he was saying, he suddenly went completely out of his mind, screaming like a lunatic, going from desk to desk, seizing the cards, sometimes from inside the desk or from our hands, until he had a huge pile of them on his desk, which he then shuffled into a tower, laid on its side, and brushed into a drawer, locking it ostentatiously with a little key. Tracy said nothing, but her piggy nose flared, and I thought, oh dear, doesn't Mr. Sherman realize she'll never forgive him? And that same afternoon after school, we walked home together. She wouldn't talk to me. She was still in her fury. But when I tried to turn into my estate, she grabbed my wrist and led me across the road to hers. All the way up in the lift, we were silent. It seemed to me something momentous was about to happen. I could feel her rage like an aura around her. It almost vibrated. When we got to the front door, I saw that the knocker, which was a brass lion of Judah with its mouth open, bought on the high road from an Afrikaner stall, had been damaged and was now hanging from a single nail, and I wondered, has your father been round again? I followed Tracy to her room. Once the door was closed, she turned on me, glaring as if I myself were Mr. Sherman, asking me sharply what I wanted to do now that we were here. I had no idea. Never before had I been canvassed for ideas of what to do. She was the one with all the ideas. There'd never been any planning by me before today. What's the point of coming round if you don't fucking know? She flopped down onto her bed, picked up Pac-Man and started playing. I felt my face getting hot. I meekly suggested practicing our triple time steps, but this made Tracy groan. I don't need to. I'm on to wings. But I can't do wings yet. Look, she said, without raising her eyes from her screen, you can't get silver without doing wings. Forget about gold. So what's your dad going to come and watch you fuck it all up for? No point, is there? I looked at my stupid feet that couldn't do wings. I sat down and began quietly to cry. But this changed nothing, and after a minute I found myself pitiful and stopped. I decided to busy myself organizing Barbie's wardrobe. All her clothes had been stuffed into Ken's open-top automobile, and it was my plan to extract them, flatten them, hang them on their little hangers, and place them back in the wardrobe. The kind of game I was never permitted to play at home due to its echoes of domestic oppression. Well, halfway through this painstaking procedure, Tracy's heart mysteriously softened toward me. She slipped from her bed, joined me cross-legged on the floor, and together we got that tiny white woman's life in order. Well, we had a favorite video. It was labeled Saturday Cartoons and Top Hat, and moved weekly from my flat to Tracy's and back, played so often that the tracking ate the frame from above and below. Because of this, we couldn't risk forward winding while playing. It made the tracking worse, so we forward wound blind, guessing at duration by assessing the width of the black tape as it flew from one reel to another. Tracy was an expert forward winder. She seemed to know in her body exactly when we'd gone past the irrelevant cartoons and when to press stop to reach, for example, the song Cheek to Cheek. It strikes me now that if I want to watch this same clip as I did a few minutes ago just before writing this, it's no effort at all. It's the work of a moment. I type my request in the box and it's there. Back then, there was a craft to it. We were the first generation to have in our own homes the means to and forward wind reality. Even very small children could press their fingers against those clunky buttons and see what has been become what is or what will be. When Tracy was about this process, she was absolutely concentrated. She would not press play until she had Fred and Ginger exactly where she wanted them, on the balcony, among the bougainvillea and the Doric columns. At which point she began to read the dance, as I never could. She saw everything. Stray ostrich feathers hitting the floor, the weak muscles in Ginger's back, the way Fred had to jerk her up from any supine position, spoiling the flow, ruining the line. She noticed the most important thing of all, which is the dance lesson within the performance. With Fred and Ginger, you can always see the dance lesson. In a sense, the dance lesson is the performance. He's not looking at her with love, not even fake movie love. He's looking at her as our teacher looked at us. Don't forget X. Please keep in mind Y. Arm up now, leg down, spin, dip, bow. Look at her, Tracy said, smiling oddly, pressing a finger to Ginger's face on the screen. She looks fucking scared. It was during one of these viewings that I learned something new and important about her father, Louis. On this occasion, the flat was empty, and as it annoyed Tracy's mother when we watched the same clip multiple times, that afternoon we indulged ourselves. The moment Fred came to a rest and leaned against the balustrade, Tracy shuffled forward on all fours and pressed the button down again, and off we went, back to what once was. Must have watched the same clip a dozen times, until suddenly it was enough. Tracy got up and told me to follow. It was dark outside. I wondered when her mother would be home. We walked past the kitchen to the bathroom. It was exactly the same as my bathroom. Same cork floor, same avocado bathroom set. She got down on her knees and pushed the side panel of the bath. It fell in easily. Sitting in a Clark's shoebox just by the pipes was a small gun. Tracy picked up the box and showed it to me. She told me it was her father's, that he'd left it here, and when Michael came to Wembley at Christmas, Louis would be his security man, as well as one of his dancers. It had to be that way to confuse people. It was all top secret. You tell anyone, she told me, and you're dead. She put the panel back and went to the kitchen to start making her tea. I headed home. I remember feeling intensely envious of the glamour of Tracy's family life compared to my own, its secret and explosive nature. And I walked toward my own flat, trying to think of some equivalent revelation I could offer to Tracy the next time I saw her, a terrible illness or a new baby, but there was nothing. That's it. Thank you. We are dressed very alike this time, though, by some
Seriously.
crazy
I
coincidence.
nailed it. It took 5 years, but she noticed my outfit. So when I was in London when I was really young, my dad is Ghanaian. I remember once having someone mention the word half-caste
Right.
around me, and it startled me.
Yeah.
And it's a word that you mention here, and it made me think in so many ways swing time is sort of a cartography of being in between.
Right. I mean, it was a word that was extremely common in England when I was a kid. I would say it was the word, really. Mm-hmm. My family's objection to it, I mean, it was very adamant, but it meant you were continually having to correct people, you know, on a kind of daily basis. And I had a phobia towards the word. But yes, that sense of being in between, because in England, the construction of mulatto-dom is very binary. It's really considered to be that you are in some way split between two realities. And I always found that a strange thought.
Because one of the things you really do in swing time, like quite brilliantly, is show how we're all in between.
Right.
If you're Lemon, you're in between. If you're Hawa, you're in between. If you're the narrator, if you're Tracy, everyone is looking to belong.
Right. And also, it's about the legitimacy of your concerns. Like, I was so struck last year, or maybe the year before, when I saw the Black Panthers movie at the Forum. And I'm 41 years old now. And some childish part of me, I was looking at all these incredible women who were running that movement. And a lot of them were my shade.
Right. Elaine Brown and all of them, yeah.
And I had this kind of childish part of me, feel a resolution, you know, in some way, that the feeling of illegitimacy, which I think is given to mixed-race children a lot, which is constructed very differently in America, partly because of the rules of slavery, which involve this one-drop reality and the construction of the way people lived in their neighborhoods. But it reminded me that there is nothing illegitimate in my genetic makeup, you know. Right. Whereas I think when I was a child, I felt a kind of double illegitimacy, like to belong to neither side was very difficult.
You wrote a piece many years ago for The New Yorker called Sweet Charity.
Yeah.
About friendship and money.
Right.
And the narrator deals with a friend named Christine. The narrator is you, it's not
Yeah,
fiction.
that's me, yeah.
And you've loaned money to a friend
who
you grew up with, and your paths have kind of diverged.
Right.
What's the sort of origin for Swing Time? Is it autobiographical, you think, or did you want to just write about friendship and girlhood?
I wanted to write about dance, really, and dance's relation to Black life. That was the first thought. I was very struck by this thing, the idea, even if it's a kind of anthropological myth, the idea that tap dancing began on slave ships in a mixture of, you know, Irish indigent workers and slaves above deck, mixing and creating this dance form. It really stuck in my mind, along with another sentiment I heard someone say about the idea that when slaves were divested of everything, all their belongings, all their clothes, their families, obviously, and then also the drum. Maybe some people had a drum, right? When even that was taken away, the only thing left is the body as an instrument of art and movement. And so I thought about that, and I tried to think about my own interest in dance, and I wanted to write almost a fable around it, you know? And that was the kind of intellectual spur of it. And then there's all kinds of personal things in it. There always are in my fiction, but it's hard to describe. It's not a direct autobiographical thing. It's always a kind of fake reconstruction. Like in this book, there's this character, Jenny Lagon, who's a black tap dancer who had lots of minor roles in great American movies, was a wonderful dancer. And I only found out about her when I was writing this book. But the book tries to imagine what it was like to have always known about her, you know? Right. So it's a kind of false construction of memory. You're creating a life which is what if? What if I had had this friend? What if this had happened? What if I hadn't, if I had failed my exams instead of passed them? What if, what if, what if? That's how I write, really, on a series of hypotheticals.
One of the things that I was so struck by in Swing Time is you mentioned Michael Jackson when he's leaning forward in Smooth Criminal. Those are actually a technological sort of invention that he patented to hammer his shoes to the floor. So that move we think of when Michael goes 90 degrees, I never knew that.
No, I never knew it. And I found it, I know I have a Michael Jackson issue or preoccupation of some kind.
Like meaning you love him?
I do love him.
You love him. It's amazing.
I love him, but I think that he was an extremely traumatic figure for Black children all over the world. Yeah. Like, he was traumatizing to me.
Right.
That's
no,
what
I remember
mean
when he
him.
turned. I remember watching him with my grandmother, Man in the Mirror, and she said, "He's back. He found Jesus," and so she was.
That was not my reaction to that video.
Right. No. I mean, I thought this was crazy, but she was wrapped up in the 40-year narrative of all of his twists and turns. Is he black? Is he white? Is he this? What is?
But that's surreal. I mean,
it was unreal.
It was unreal, and for me, it was a very formative and traumatic experience. Also, because I felt. I never know, talking about Jackson, how people feel about him, but my feeling was, like, when he turned up in Thriller, already what he had done to his face I found deeply shocking. And I think what I found most shocking about it is that it was so beloved. Yeah. People were basically saying, oh, that's much better. Right. With that tiny little nose and your skin a little bit and no afro. That's much better. Right. And that's the bit I found so disturbing, that he saw that America loved what he was doing to himself and he kept going. And what he was doing to himself was divesting himself of any sign of African heritage in his face. And for me, that was heartbreaking, because he was my hero when I was a kid. And I found it a heartbreaking progression.
I met with the young students who were here today who've been studying your work. And they had so many great questions that I said I wanted to take some to you. Sure. One of them mentioned that she'd been watching an interview with you, I guess on YouTube, which someone told me is the National Black Archives, really. You know, you can watch Ella Fitzgerald, Betty Carter, Michael Jackson. She said, Zadie mentioned that she records notes about faces and then writes them down. And she wanted to know, is that true? How did that process work in Swing Time?
Oh yeah, no, that's not true. I never make notes of any kind, but I love faces. That's very true. And it would be very common for me to come home and talk about people I had seen, their faces, what they look like, just a kind of curiosity about people's faces. And my study in London is decorated with portraits, just people's faces. I'm kind of animated by them, and for me they're like the best prompt, or if I see somebody in the street, it's usually enough, you know, just something they do with their face. Or my husband said that I don't find anybody ugly, and that is true. Or I'm attracted to extreme ugliness as well, you know. I find it all very interesting. Yeah, every extremities in people's face, or seeing in someone's face, particularly in women, I guess, the thing that they think is wrong. You know, if you see a woman in the street and you know that she hates her nose, right, or the huge mole on her cheek, or it's those things that I'm always very engaged by for some reason. And it filters into the writing too.
The narrator everyone talks about doesn't have a name.
No. Which is, I think, made reviewing it very annoying for many people.
I've noticed they do weird things. They do in R, and I noticed, like, is in R something for narrator I didn't know?
I'm thinking about it as a review. It would be a difficult thing to do.
When you make a choice like that, why you don't maybe have to reveal your hand, but
it's a lot of the choices you make. I think big things like that are instinctive. It's something to do with the tone you're trying to get. Retrospectively, being asked about it, I did think about it. Like, why? Because I think it's within my capacities and interests to write a very different kind of narrator. Like the kind of narrator we've become very familiar with, who is a personality in themselves, you know? Mm-hmm. Who's entertaining and funny and has a very particular way of speaking, or a kind of Confederacy of Dunces type arc of character. And I think, for me, it was a kind of personal objection. It's hard to put into words, but I felt that at the moment, that kind of persona, because that's what it is very, very common in the culture. I mean, not just in fiction, but in people's Instagram accounts and their Twitter and the way they express themselves. And I don't think, it's not that I'm against that kind of persona, but I wanted to write something existential. I wanted to write about being alive rather than performing a personality to somebody. So I just left her completely empty, you know, I wanted it to be empty. And the things that make her a person are the decisions she makes, you know? And your reader is left quite free to judge her. But I wanted it that way rather than, here's an incredibly charming, funny person who maybe as a reader you are like or not like, or you relate to or don't relate to. I kind of wanted to cut that all off at the pass. Not that I don't think it's a worthwhile relation, but I think there's so much of it in the culture that maybe it would be okay not to have it in my novel, to try and pursue something else.
I love the mother character.
Yeah.
So much. In a way, I think at first I felt protective of her. I remember when you sent me a draft, I said, I don't like some of the characterizations. They feel, and then I realized, oh, this is because the mother character reminds me of my mom so much.
Right.
And I noticed you dedicated this book to your mom, and there's a theme of motherhood in it.
Yeah, I mean, she read it and she thought smartly, and I agree with her, that the mother is more me than her. I mean, in terms of the actual biography, you know, the didactic stuff and the obsession with books. I think part of it is like casting yourself into the future. I recognize that as a thing I do when I'm writing fiction. It's subconscious. Like thinking, what would my daughter say about me? Right. What would she say about me? What kind of account would she give of me? And obviously, I hope she doesn't give an account like this. Right. But fiction works off extremity, you know. So I took the bits of myself that I find slightly unnerving and extended them, you know, and added them certainly to my mother's will. She's a very willful person, but people who know my mother would also say, I think, that she's much more she's a party girl, you know. She's not. Right. This woman doesn't party.
It's severe.
Yeah, right. She's very severe, and my mother is not severe. She wants to have fun all the time, in every circumstance. So it's a different kind of person. But I did take elements of her forcefulness. She's very forceful. That's for sure. Yeah.
You get the tiny white woman's life in order, and there's a little bit of the comment on black women in labor.
Right.
And I read somewhere, I think it was in Slate, where you said this, you know, a book is for everyone, obviously, but this is very much a book you intended for black women and black girls as an audience.
I mean, that's why I wrote it. I think we talked a bit before when Toni Morrison said something similar, broader. She's talking about her work, the black audience for her work in England. It caused such a furor.
People hate that she said that. And
I was really unnerved by the reaction. I thought, all writers have this kind of intention. You know, it doesn't. We want to be read by everybody. That's the whole purpose. But in each book, you might have someone special, some ideal reader. You know, I think that's the most natural thing in the world. And when I wrote this, I was thinking of black girls and also generations of black girls. And I mean, one of the things about the mother character here is she's kind of deformed by her experience in that she has to be so defensive of her child because she considers the world to be dangerous for her child that it kind of deforms their relationship. And I think that's a common theme amongst black mothers and their daughters, you know, that there's this kind of sense that your mother is trying to protect you from something, but she has to do it so much that it's hard to have a natural relation, you know. So I wanted to write about that, but I'm always hoping that I can bring people into that experience, I guess. I like the idea of, you know, a teenage white boy reading this book. I want that conversation to happen. It's important to me.
Well, tap is an interesting metaphor, and even as you put it, is that all dance, we know, you know, and you said this, dancers look at other dancers and disadmire the technique and the adaptive process and the learning process and the skill. And it's not something that has a lot of borders.
Right.
And so in some way, tap or dance or those sort of classical musicals in here function as an entryway to how we understand race.
Right. I mean, those movies are so complicated, you know.
They are complicated.
And when I was a kid, because they were on TV all the time, I used to watch them, and I mean, I had mixed feelings, because on the one hand, obviously they have these ridiculous minstrelsisms and terrible scenes, but in the context of British television, that was the most black people I was likely to see on television.
Right.
So they meant a lot to me for that reason. And also when you start to read around, as I kind of did quite young, and realized what a battle it was. Like the NAACP were on set trying to improve the conditions. Some of the actors were like, give me a fucking break, I'm making money.
Right.
Like Hattie McDaniels made the point, I'm the richest maid in America.
Right.
Leave me alone.
Right.
Like they wanted to play these roles because they were well paid and it was working. Then there were extremities like Step and Fetch It, who was, you know, painful for everyone to watch, and even Hattie McDaniels would want a separation from that kind of caricature. So I was kind of very curious about the drama going on behind those films, I guess.
Right, yeah. And also, you know, it's not just in England that you watch those characters. I definitely remember, you know, those crows on a fence sort of being soulful, and I'd get really into it. I was like, yes.
In Dumbo.
You know, and this is
Black
soulful. And only later did I realize, like, this is you know, I'm not supposed to relate to this imagining of blackness, but the rhythm and all the cadences and the things that I admired in the music I was supposed to relate to could be found there. And it's never neat. It's always a little messy.
Neat. And the need to have it neat can be very comic. Like I have a friend recently, a white friend who's a writer, who went to see Othello and came back really enraged. He said to me, you know, that play should never be shown. The black guy dies and the woman dies. It's an outrage. And it really made me laugh. You know, but it's like a retrospective rage against a 15th century play.
Yeah.
And it's you know, it's funny.
Yeah.
That kind of policing is quite funny. And also because Othello meant so much to me when I was a kid. You know, when you're going through Shakespeare and you find this incredibly complicated character. But I love the idea just on body count. It's like, this is a racist play with this.
Yeah, yeah. Imagine that.
And it was being done on my behalf. You know, he was angry for me, which is very moving. But yeah, I'm okay with Othello. I like Othello.
You made peace with Shakespeare.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the things the other students asked is, you wrote about Africa.
Yes.
Have you ever been to Africa? And if so, what did you think? And I knew that you had been because you've written about it in your essays, but...
Well, I went, the first time I went was to Liberia as a journalist. And then I went a few times to Liberia and then to Ghana for family reasons. My mother was involved in Ghana, in Ghanaian life. She had a Ghanaian husband at one point. And then I started going to the Gambia. And I think in the Gambia particularly, I had this very sentimental reaction probably, but it felt significant to me. Maybe it's middle age, that also happens, but even simple echoes of Jamaican life, of compound life, seemed very familiar. It was really interesting to see that. Women
It's
and their
funny how
children.
Africa functions that way for people.
Yeah, I went as a stranger, and I couldn't resist this feeling of kinship. And I thought about it and how when we were kids, like, we would listen to those records, like the Richard Pryor thing about going back to Africa. Me and my brother listened to obsessively. And I guess we always thought, well, we're not going to make that sentimental error of going to Africa and thinking, you know, it's home. And then I got to Africa and I was like, it's home.
Right.
So that happened immediately. But it was really a great experience. You know, it was nice, and it was on. I guess when I've been there before, it's with my mother, or I've been in Jamaica, it's through my mother's family. It was just nice to be there by myself and to have independent impressions. But it was a wonderful thing. Just simple questions that I think I'd had as a kid, particularly about the literature, about the idea of this verbal culture, of aphorisms particularly,
right,
and how they're used. I mean, you're always taught in a very vague way at university, this concept, but I think I needed to see for myself what an extraordinary tapestry of culture that involves. Right. When you have people who have a phrase for every circumstance. Mm-hmm. It's such an extraordinary idea. And that the wisest person in any circumstance is the one who has the right verbal response to the matter in hand. Right. The thing which made me feel more at home than anything else, because it felt rightly to me. I guess that's what it was. I felt like I was amongst people for whom language was like illuminated, like it could change things. It could make a decision happen. It was law. It was really animated. And I felt kind of angry and sad retrospectively that in English schools, where there are so many kids like me from Caribbean backgrounds who really would have benefited so much of having any kind of historical understanding of where they had come from, of what had been involved. I felt that, because I was there on a school trip, because my daughter's school had gone, and I felt that it's a kind of crime what was done to Caribbean kids in the 70s. Like, you just had no idea.
Where you came from.
You had no idea, and most Jamaican kids, I was one of them, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, but I know I wasn't alone, had no idea that Jamaicans were not native to Jamaica.
Right.
I mean, that's a pretty fundamental fact. Had no idea that there had been an Indian population, that we had been moved from somewhere else. I didn't know that till very late. And that is insanity.
And in this book, you know, you mentioned that the narrator thinks her Uncle Lambert's garden is Jamaica. Right. And so there's that sort of amnesia and erasure of origin completely. To fit in. To fit in, and also because for my mother's generation, they were left as very small children in Jamaica while their parents came over to work on buses. Right. In my mother's case, my grandmother was an orderly in a hospital. So it was a lot of trauma, you know, no parents, and then suddenly you turn up, usually as a late teenager, as an early adult, and completely adrift, you know. This is a moment that, to me, in the larger world, is a sort of renaissance of Black art. That's how it feels, yeah. Right? Where so many people are trying to figure out where we are. And Swing Time feels perfectly and firmly placed in that moment for me. You know, I love being able to listen to Frank Ocean and read Swing Time and think about all of this work that's going on, where people are sort of saying, I'm not what you think I am, but I am things that I'm not supposed to be, and all of it's Black. It's really intense. Like, when I was writing, I had this excitement because I could see around the edges of what I was doing. I knew that Frank had an album out. I could see that there was this book called Homegoing, and I wasn't allowed to look at any of it because I had this work to do. So I was writing, thinking, God, when will this novel be finished and I can go and read and listen to all this stuff. So the moment it was finished, that's kind of what I did. Yeah. And I always think that's a lovely feeling when you realize you've been working not alone. Obviously alone because you don't know these people, but in some kind of chamber, and you're hearing each other. Even if you never read or listen to this thing, you're in the same moment somehow. So for me, I mean, I've spoken about it a lot, but the first thing I read after this was Homegoing, and I was just absolutely astounded that a 23-year-old woman could
reconstruct that history.
And reach back.
And reach back in a way that seemed as if it was being lived, that it was real. It just made me feel very excited, because school kids are presumably going to read that book, and they're not going to be kept in the kind of ignorance that I was in, I think, for a long time.
Cool. So I know we have to take questions from the audience.
Hey, I can't see any of you, it's weird.
And Bernard has, thank you,
Hey.
Bernard.
Are you up there too? Full house, jeez. Thank you. Oh, are they on paper? Okay.
There are, that's
Sorry.
what I'm reading.
I thought the people were going to start shouting.
The handwriting. Wow. Okay, so this is a good one, and there's no name. I recently resolved to read your New York Review of Books essay on optimism and despair on a regular basis to keep me from said despair for the foreseeable future. What text do you return to keep you from despair or undue optimism?
Yeah, well, undue optimism is what I tend to suffer from more regularly. That's a really good question. There's bits of Kierkegaard I read a lot. I don't know why. Just the intensity of it, the feeling of it. I don't know. It makes me feel optimistic for some reason when I read him. It's a kind of religious thing, I guess. I'm not religious myself, but that's as close as someone like me gets to that kind of feeling. I read that. And sometimes to correct optimism, almost anything about the climate will send me into... I'll be lying on the floor for 2 days after that.
The guy who drove me here drives you, I guess, often, and he said, yeah, the climate's done, and so what? You want progress, or do you want regression? None of it matters, this is. And I said,
Yeah.
whoa, I'm never using your driver
right.
again.
No.
Why is that?
Yeah.
This is crazy.
It's...
Oh, my friend Thomas and I were scared.
Right.
Yeah. So it's true, anything about the climate.
Anything in relation to the climate, I find it hard to keep going when I'm faced with that
And
reality.
your piece on Brexit was great, and I was reading an interview you did before our election here, where you were kind of looking at America as a safe haven.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now you're between a rock and a hard place, in a way. Or we all are, right? Because my whole thing was, oh, you know what? I have dual citizenship to England. I'll be fine.
Yeah.
And then I went to go get my Commonwealth. My dad's Ghanaian again, and they were like, no, you can get Ghanaian citizenship. I was like, I'll take it.
Yeah.
Anything, because it is a weird moment. And so I guess, are you feeling a sense of despair?
No, I think it is a bit like losing two homes. Like a friend of mine, Hari Kunzru, who's the same British Indian and here in America, he said that, and I agree with him. I think middle age does that anyway, that you lose the past, you know, so your version of whatever it is gone anyway. So even in peaceful times, I think British writers are very prone to a sentimental sadness about an England lost. That's been going on since English literature began.
Yeah.
So I was already prone to that. This hasn't helped, for sure. Yeah. But, I mean, the one thing that does strike me, and I've spoken about a bit, is that in England, I mean, I might just be talking about my friends, but our tendency, like after Brexit, is to whine and write essays. That's our first response. Yeah. But the Americans I know, like the day after the election, were organizing, protesting on enormous email chains, trying to get lawyers, writers, everybody involved in this, that, and the other. Yeah. And that was completely new to me. Like, I was still just on the floor writing an essay. Yeah. And they were like, no, we're going to do things.
Yeah. No, George Washington lives on, right?
Yeah.
You think about this first patriot is really a terrorist to the British.
Right, exactly. There's something, it is an amazing thing about Americans. There is an energy there, a democratic energy that's real. Right. So I was made to be optimistic by that.
The next question is, what weighs on you heaviest? Getting started with beginnings or concluding the end and knowing how to do it?
I don't have high hopes of my endings, I suppose we'll put it that way. But it doesn't stress me out. Like this one, I like much more than usual, so that was a good sign. But it's the beginning. The beginning is hard. The first 20, 30 pages, just because you have to kind of prove to yourself that you're doing something that is of any worth, that it's going to work. Also, you're deciding on a project that might last 2, 3, 4 years, so there's a great temptation to give up. It's very strong.
Yeah.
And I have friends, like there's a writer called Jeff Dye, you know Jeff Dye.
Yeah.
Whenever I'm having a hard time in a novel, he'll always email me, have you ever tried giving up? It's wonderful.
Yeah.
I give up things all the time.
Yeah.
And I believe him. I bet it's wonderful.
But he can also turn a whole book out of giving up into a book.
He's written books about not having written a book. I
not
couldn't
all
do
of us.
that.
My new thing with my book is like, I'm going to do what Jeff Dyer did, and it's like done there, been there. You know, other people have it. You can't do that again. This is a really funny question. It's so random, but a seat at the table or lemonade? Someone pitted sisters together against each other. Ooh. I don't know why I did that, actually. Like, because, I probably shouldn't have.
It's so different.
I think both.
I really think both. In fact, together they make a kind of beautiful thing.
Aren't they better that way?
Yeah, they should be in a double album.
Like, why? And it's sort of Tracy and the narrator, right?
It's something very fearful and legible and something almost written in water, very delicate. My son, who's 3, has a real problem with Solange. He doesn't understand why she doesn't like cranes, which he thinks are birds. He's
right.
Like, why doesn't she like these birds? They're in the sky. It's no one's problem.
Yeah.
He hates it for that reason.
Yeah.
But I think it's such a beautiful, peaceful, and kind of sublime album.
Yeah.
It's very different from her sisters, but it's wonderful.
It is wonderful. And they're both 2 Black girls. And that's what I meant about this moment, where we're all figuring out who we are individually without it being oppressive.
Right.
Collectively.
Right.
And Daryl Pinckney makes that wonderful intrusion into swing time for that reason, kind of.
Yeah, he's a great critic and novelist and my friend, and I put him in the book as a person. I don't know why.
As an escape, really, literally.
Really. He kind of, he comes to save the narrator. I was thinking of him as a kind of ideal person. I guess in my novels, there's a lot of people who aren't ideal, right? They're kind of variations of not really doing things correctly, not getting it right. And I was trying to think of, you know, if you're going to write this kind of moral fiction in which everybody's shaded, like, well, you have to put your cards on the table. Like, what kind of life is the good life? And Daryl floated straight to mind for some reason. I mean, the funny thing about it was when I said to him I was doing it, he and his partner, James, they both said fine, but Daryl said, I want to see my dialogue.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. And then he rewrote his dialogue.
The dialogue is, you know, I said, when I was reading, I said, wow, the next time I have a crisis, I'm calling up Daryl and just inviting myself over, because it felt perfectly like Daryl Pinckney in the sense.
He said, because I had him going to Elvin Alley and saying something about them, and he said, I would never talk that way about dance. I would say this.
Yeah.
I was like, okay. But it was lovely putting him in, and it's just the ability he has to be both himself and committed to a political struggle, and so and full of ambivalence at the same time about all kinds of things. He's just able to hold a lot of different ideas in his head simultaneously, and that is an ideal for me, I think.
There's a moment, well, let's see one more question. What would you say is the single largest barrier to entry for Black storytellers of any medium, and how do we break that barrier?
I think it's the same for women. It depends on the historical moment. It's what Virginia Woolf was talking about, but it's something that I have a very agonized relationship with. In Room of One's Own, when she says women are angry because of their historical circumstance, and she basically argues that the anger deforms the person and deforms the prose, and so it can't have this kind of clarity and this, I guess you would say, even universality that other writers have, because they are not consumed or having to think doubly and all the rest of that. I used to think that when I was younger, I think, and I think it can, when the weight is very heavy, it can block you personally. Obviously, there's the professional aspect, which is different, but I'm talking about the kind of existential aspect. But I also think there are parts of it which are a great advantage. Like, I was thinking when I was writing this book that I always want to write a short book, but I write a long book. Why do I always write a long book? And part of the reason is because I am aware that my reader has all kinds of ideas about my characters. Yeah. That I know that. So I have to spend a lot of time dancing around, countering it, checkmating it, and the book gets long because that's what I'm doing. Yeah. But I'm glad of it, in fact. I wouldn't want this kind of clear mind that just sits and writes and thinks that me and the reader are on exactly the same place in this kind of universal sphere, and we're just going to write this clear prose. I'm kind of glad of all the complication. I think it's an interesting technical problem. And I think Woolf is a good example. I find her prose full of rage, and I like that about it.
Yeah.
I like that she's always working against the idea that someone thinks a woman writing a book is basically like a dog on its two hind legs preaching. Right. A lot of people thought that at the time, and she had to work around it at every point. But I think she's right in that if you let it cloud your mind to the point that you can't speak freely, and that all you're doing is defensive, then you have a problem.
Right.
So it's trying to find that balance, which I think she found so well.
Yeah. And then, Bernard, I don't know. What are we? I think we have 20 more minutes, or 20 minutes period. And this is from a student. What is it you would tell your younger writing self? So you write this book at 24.
Yeah.
and you're put onto a larger stage than most people will exist on for the rest of their lives. And I want to modify that question. The one thing I love about your work so much, Zadie, is it's experimental. And I almost feel like you're pushing yourself to not be bored or stagnant or lack a challenge towards the work. And in doing that, you challenge us to go with you.
I mean, partly it is about boredom. I really have to keep moving in my mind. Also to retrospectively, I suppose, justify my luck. I felt very lucky. And I have a problematic relationship with luck, I suppose. I feel like things should be earned, I suppose. So it was partly that, the feeling that something ridiculous had happened and it had to be earned backwards almost. Yeah. So there's that. But I mean, the girl who wrote that book, I kind of, it's cool. It's amazing to have so much energy. Like it seems to me like a different person. Yeah. So I wouldn't correct that. I would say, I say to my students, they don't listen to me, that maybe you don't have to write at 21. It's not like, it's not the most important thing to do. Yeah. And I suppose I did miss in my 20s a certain amount of fun, you know? Yeah. I was writing a lot. I was in my room writing a lot. And everybody else was like, yeah, having a wilder time. And I missed that part, because I like to have fun. And so I did more work than I meant to do. That's for sure, surely the case. But I'm going to sound like one of those goddamn pop stars who always says, I don't regret anything. It was all made me the person I am.
You sound like I'm me.
Yeah, nightmare. Everything in all the novels, I regret things, but yeah, I think the main thing is just I might maybe start later, and some of the things I wrote at 21, 22, it's just so they make me cringe. It's hard for me to deal with them. So that's a problem. Yeah.
And I think the thing is that it's so well earned, and at this point it's solidified. And I think most of us feel that way in this room, and so we're grateful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, that's nice. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.